Well, good afternoon, and thank you for coming. It's delightful to be here. I'd like to take a couple of minutes and talk with you about the process of writing about evolution in science fiction and speculative fiction. And in that process, we'll take a little time and talk about evolution in scientific terms, not too technically, but enough to show us where the story has to go. And then we'll take a bit of time and talk about some of the issues that would naturally arise in terms of writing a book that involves these kinds of themes. And then finally we'll take some sections from the book. I don't want to burden you with them, but to show you kind of how it plays out. So first, I understand that evolution is a little controversial in this town. It's always been controversial, and it's always been controversial in every place that it's taken seriously. For a writer, though, that controversy is an absolute thing of beauty. The very idea of evolution unlocks the mind, and it makes us wonder, what will become of us? Where did we come from? It thrills us, and it scares us to death. Evolution is a natural theme for science and speculative fiction, and certainly I'm hardly the first to say so. But it only seems to grow in our imagination. But evolution for us is both a scientific theory, and it's also a metaphor for some of the larger themes in our lives. As a scientific theory, in what I call the scientific American crowd, it's unchallenged. It's challenged all sorts of other places, but in the scientific community, it is the great rock on which every new facet that gets explored lays a new element of knowledge at our feet and helps us unlock the mystery of our own life. But evolution plays a special kind of role in the mind of the public. People think they understand it. At least they think they ought to understand it. If you come up and talk to someone about evolution, almost any aspect of evolution, they will enter into a dialogue and a discourse. It's become a metaphor for change in our lives, but a special kind of change. It's become a metaphor for scientifically induced change. And it is also a metaphor for elements of loss of control, which so many in our culture feel. The word evolution brings out many, many feelings as well as thoughts. Evolution is much too big a field to do anything more than a snippet about here. And evolution and ethics are something which automatically come to mind. All of science is embroiled in this. And whereas evolution and ethics were an obvious ethical choice, we have in Julia and the Dreammaker questions about the ethics of mathematics and the use of mathematics. And we spend some time in the book, I spend some time in the book, talking about the game of life and how seductive the game of life is to mathematicians. Because, of course, everybody is tempted to be a god. And I'm always reminded of an exchange between Heisenberg and Einstein. Werner Heisenberg was the equal of Einstein intellectually. Heisenberg developed what he considered to be one of the basic tenets of modern physics, and that's the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. And for those of you who don't know this, it turns out that you can't know both where something is and where it's going at the same time. You can know that there's error with that. And the reason for it, Einstein always said, is that you don't know where something is or where it's going, because to find out where it is, you got to go hit it with something. You got to hit it with a photon, or you got to hit it and see the reaction, then you know where it is. And as soon as you do, it's going someplace else. Heisenberg took the position that the universe was fundamentally random, and that you didn't know where it was going because it didn't know where it was going. And then, of course, you have the famous quip in which Einstein wrote Heisenberg and said, "God doesn't play craps with the universe," to which Heisenberg responded, "Don't tell God what to do." Biology's been in the thick of ethical issues since its earliest days, but it got eclipsed in the 1950s and 60s by the physicists, of all people. And if we think back to that period, physics was embroiled in controversy as the physicists stood eyeball to eyeball with nuclear winter in the 1960s as a result of the development of the atomic weapons. And it was in the 50s and 60s that physics was trying to sift out what was right and wrong about their inventions. And it was at that time that we had a speech by Richard Feynman. Feynman was, of course, a Nobel-winning physicist. And he gave a speech in 1964 called "The Role of Scientific Culture in Modern Society." And in it he said, "May I say, too, that among all of us here who are mainly physicists, I think that most assuredly the next science to find itself in moral difficulty with its application is biology." And, well, certainly he was correct, but I'd like to add a small footnote. Just because the biologists got into trouble with their inventions didn't help the physicists one bit. The physicists merely compounded all their problems by jumping into the fray and creating fields like biophysics, biochemistry, bioengineering, which are hotbeds of discovery and controversy all over the place now. Darwinian notions that nature was red in tooth and claw resonate with human thought and experience. And if Darwin hadn't done anything more than to describe nature in that combative way, it would have inspired any number of books and writers. There would have been no end to it in sight. But of course, he went on, and there's lots more. What Darwin came up with was a stroke of inductive genius. He intuited the notion of the survival of the fittest. The ancient past was not the same as the present. Things had not always been the same since the beginning. Call it creation, if you like. Creatures changed and natural selection did it. Natural selection, a silent, relentless, tireless force that changed the whole face of nature and changes it still. And it doesn't matter what we call it. It doesn't matter whether we call it natural selection or whether evolution as a theory gets replaced by something else that's more advanced than even kind of the post-Darwinianism that imbues the field now. The data has to be dealt with. The data has to be answered. What is the data? The data is the dinosaur bone that sits in the floor of my apartment in New York. It's a thigh bone of a dinosaur. It's the fossil fish I have. Huge fish. They're like a foot or 2 feet long. Fossils. 50 million years ago from the Green River Formation in Wyoming. And they're extinct. Something has to explain it. So it's under constant refinement. But think about what evolution is as Darwin thought about it. Tiny little steps over long periods of time changing things. That's not going to make a good book. Readers don't usually have 20 or 30 million years to see how it turns out. So you take a little slice, a tiny little part of the theory. And for me, it was punctuated equilibrium. It was this notion that you go through time and you get little steps, and then boom, something happens and you move to an entirely new species or an entirely new ecosystem. And that, of course, was Stephen Jay Gould's contribution. And there's more, lots more. There's coevolution. Modern thinkers about evolution almost talk about it mystically, too. And this is really slippery slope for a writer, because when you deal with these topics that are as big as the universe and go back to prime movers through thousands of generations, it's really awe-inspiring, but it's tricky because it's not supposed to be sentimental. It's a fact and a science. It must be respected and dealt with on its own scale. So you get things like Daniel Dennett, who's a very accomplished scientist in his own right. And he says something like this: if the mind is an algorithm, surely it is not an algorithm that is recognizable to or acceptable to those minds that it creates. If there's a math program out there that made us, we probably won't accept it or recognize it. But what if we did? Because Stephen, the protagonist in the book, does. The very idea of evolution, it seems to me, has had a profound impact on literature. The idea of evolution imbues a literary mind, and here I'm going to take a little license, imbues a literary mind with a little more literary license. Not only can you write about exploring Tolstoy's loves in the thick of a war, but you can portray a whole world that is at war with itself at its essence. And beyond this, dealing with evolution necessarily challenges the structure of the novel itself. Its own fabric must change. If you're in a dynamic setting, the setting must share time with the characters. And it evolves a tension between the people and the ecologies, which frustrates the reader. Because the reader wants to know more about the people. But you can't tell them more about the people until you tell them what's going on that would logically make the people behave this way. You have to have characters to live out the plot. So who are they? Well, we tend to see them today as a group with a heavy overrepresentation of nerds. Now, I'm very comfortable with that. It should be obvious to you at this point that I'm very comfortable with a whole room full of nerds. But not everybody is. And the nerds have to be there because somebody's got to tell the reader and the other people in the plot what's going on. And of course, the nerds have to stir up some trouble in and of their own right, too. So, evolution spawned many, many books, and there's no time to give a taxonomy of them in here. Among the old ones, Dr. Moreau is my favorite. But there's a new crowd of people writing, and they're writing about coevolution of technologies and how people and technologies interact. And these technologies are sensitive, charming technologies evolving with us, and that's certainly what's going on in Julia. I'm putting the last touches on the next Julia. And here's evolution again, but this is coevolution. We develop with our technologies. Maybe we develop in spite of them. They have their own sense of things. It's not necessarily good. It's not necessarily evil, but it's different. And for us, the reader, certainly not beyond good and evil. So Julia technically interacts with us. She's a technology, and the interaction is psychological, analytical, emotional, and finally physical. And the characters confront all the morality of what they're doing while they're doing it, as though they can't not do it. And here's an important point about these characters. We need to be true to them. What are they? They're brainy, nerdy, solitary. You get a lot of Stephen brooding. He's obsessive. Otherwise, it wouldn't happen. Stephen gets to watch his computer as prime mover as he ruminates over science and morality and watches invent whole worlds by its own rules. So we'll take a couple of minutes. We'll read a few parts of the book, and we'll kind of see how this stuff comes out in the washer, So you're in Stephen's lab, and he's been cranking away. It's the middle of the night, and he's been having weird interactions with this computer program that he wrote, which keeps interfering in the lab. Now, the physics of it is actually pretty reasonable, and if you read the book, you'll read about complementarity and some other kinds of things, but I don't want to get into that. I want you to be in the lab. The lights began to flicker, and Stephen knew that this time for sure he was not alone. It sent a chill through him. There was a whole world with him. It was moonrise. The world had a familiar sense of dimensions with hills in the distance, and he'd seen some of it before. The rough images that had been there only as brush strokes the first time around were the limbs and leaves of sinuous trees. He heard quiet drums and a rustling sound. Maybe there were insects buzzing. No, it was a breeze. He could feel the air move past him. There was a shoreline in the distance, but no sea. This somehow was the optimal way to make a world on this day in Stephen's lab. Stephen saw the program draw a circle in front of him. It was a kind of destiny for him, and he stepped into it. Then a bodiless hand took a long, crude stick and started to make marks inside the circle. Now delicately it drew a small rodent, then the details, fine details. The rodent emerged and ran into the night, then another animal, and now a bird, suddenly hundreds of them pouring out of the circle, a line of animals, almost a stream. There was another kind of creation going on. Creation without a flood because there was no water. Creation without fishes in the sea while the seas waited their turn to be made. And all the while, Stephen's data files were humming, uploading all of this technical knowledge into this new space. Stephen grew tired and lay down in the circle and breathed the charm of making. He slept in the arms of the sixth day. Stephen woke up with a start. The alarm on his computer was ringing. Benny was banging at the door. He'd almost forgotten it was the day of his defense. So, a book like this is supposed to make us ask, where do we come from? Where do the technologies come from? Think about where Stephen's technology came from. 100 babies waited to be handed over to 100 new mothers. Fathers prowled the corridor, sure that they could identify their own progeny based on only their own good looks. Fathers were proud of what they'd done. They gazed at myriad toes and fingers grasping for new light. Pink faces, brown, and here and there a yellow. Parents saw only a room full of joy. But ever did the babies cry out in terror to have joined us on this mad stage. Their fearful din rose up to heaven, for none had asked for this fate. None had asked to come here. None, save only one. Of course, that's Stephen's machine. So, a novel also has to deal with personal evolution, or else it's not satisfying. So, here I'm going to tell you a little bit about the next book and tell you that Ellie, who's Stephen's colleague and lover, goes with the group to South America. They're on the run. They're living a dangerous life. Knowing anything is a little dangerous, and they know a lot. And so they end up in a little town in Colombia called Leticia, Colombia. And Leticia is hard scrabble living, but with pretensions. So Leticia's in the middle of the jungle, and the city fathers decide they will make a zoo, because a real city has a zoo, and there is one in Leticia. On the other hand, the people live in crushing poverty, and Ellie sees it, and she writes a poem. And this is Ellie's poem. It's called Leticia. Leticia, Leticia, who told you that you were naked? Leticia, was it the missionaries who bound your breasts? Leticia, was it the priests who taught you the word sin? Leticia, was it the Jesuits who named you like a beast of the forest? Poor Leticia, was it the Spanish maiming your children for rubber? Or Leticia, was it the Americans in their motors tearing at the forest's flesh? Leticia, did a shaman from the jungle come to your squalid port to tell you? Leticia, who told you that you were naked and needed a zoo? Leticia, or did you always know? From the turkey buzzard ever circling, making eternally slow swoops over the town. From the beginning, sitting in the iron tree, teaching you about sin. Leticia, Leticia, who told you that you were naked? Not the river or the trees, but in the trees, the silent sentinel saying sin. Thank you.